Looking to decorate some easy cookies this summer? Well, I've got a great set for you. Might look a little complicated, but I'm going to break it down for you step by step to make it really easy. So let's get into it. Okay, so we're going to start with our outline here. I've got my outline thick consistency, and I'm going to touch down on each corner, each sharp edge, and every round part, I'm going to lift my bag up a little bit. The smaller round parts, I lift my bag up very slightly, and then, on the bottom part of the watermelon where it's bigger, I can lift it up a little bit higher. And think of it as a string. When you lift up a string and you lay it down, it comes out, if you pull it, it'll come out nice and straight. That's kind of what we're doing. As the icing is attaching to the cookies, I'm sort of pulling it with my icing bag. That way I get a nice smooth line. And then I'm going to go in with my flood icing here. I like to leave my outline to dry for a couple minutes. Sometimes when I go right away to flood, the flood pulls my outline, and then sometimes it just messes up my shape there. So I like to let my outline dry. It holds the flood in nicely and it stays in place. Now once I'm done my flood, I'm going to set this aside for a little while just to dry. I want it to crust over just so the icing is not going to seep into my next step. And here I'm just pulling the icing all the way to the edges to get nice sharp edges on the bite there of the watermelon. And now that my pink section has crusted over, I'm going to go and do the green part. And again, I'm using my outline consistency. It's nice and thick. It's going to hold the shape. And you can see that when I lay the outline down, it stays in place. It still has that, shape that it's coming out of the bag. If this was my flood, it would start to sort of flatten out and seep over the edge of the cookie. So that's how you can tell if it's outline or flood. And here I'm using the same consistency, my outline consistency, and just doing a little squiggly line. This prevents craters because when you have small, narrow areas, as the icing dries, it tends to cave in on itself. So sometimes you can even get holes. It caves in so much. So this really helps prevent that. And here my icing is just starting to go a little bit too much over the edge. So I'm just going to take my scribe along the edge of the cookie and just clean a little bit of that icing up. So I'm just going to taking a little bit of the icing away. And then with my bag, I'm going to pull the icing forward a bit just to stretch it out so it doesn't pool there again. Worst case, if your icing starts to drip over the side of your cookie and it's dried or almost dried, you can take a very sharp knife and kind of just slice it off at the edge of your cookie. And while my green icing is still wet, I'm going to add some white flood icing. Just going to add a few lines here and there. And then I'm going to go in with my scribe. And my icing is not coming out there very well, but that's okay because we're not going for perfection here. We're going to be mixing it up anyways. And I'm just going to go in and mix it up with my scribe here. I don't want the white lines to stay as is. I just want to get a little bit of white, accent or a little bit of light in there just to get a more color and more fun look. And this is a wet on wet. So this is done right after I flood so that I can go and mix before the icing starts drying on me. And you don't have to do this step, but it's just fun to know a few more techniques and to give you guys different ideas of what you can do. Okay, so now I'm going to add a few seeds. I'm going to take my black outline consistency. So this is thicker icing. I want it to hold its shape, so that's why I'm using thick icing. And I'm just putting pressure on one spot and then dragging the bag out as I let go of the pressure. And there you have it. Okay, now we have a cactus cookie. little guy here, and we are going to outline him with our green outline consistency. So again, I use these outlines to keep the shape of the cookie and the icing. Some people like to use one consistency, and that's fine too. For me, this works better. I find that when I use a thicker icing for the outline and let it dry, it really holds the shape well. And not only that, I don't have to be so careful when I'm flooding. If my flood is a little bit looser, it's okay because this will hold it in. Some people like to use a really, really thin line. Sometimes, mine comes a little bit thicker or thinner, depends. But I generally use about this size, a little bit thinner maybe. And you can see there, like if you're not going right on the edge or you're not going exactly, you can always pull that line up a bit. Because it's thicker icing, it doesn't quite stick to the cookie like flood does. So if you have a few issues, you can lift up the line and kind of relay it down where you want it to go. And then I'm going to go in with my flood. And you can see that my piping tip is right next to the inside of that outline. So I'm sort of pushing the flood onto the outline to hide it as much as possible. I try to get the icing to go a little bit on top, but notice on the inside curves, I won't over flood that because I don't want to drip it over. So it's kind of a practice makes perfect type thing. Whereas you get comfortable and you find the right angles with your bag, then you can sort of push the icing and you get a feel for it. And then while this is still wet, again, I'm going to add a few of these white lines. This is my flood icing again. So it's going to sort of melt into that green flood. And I'm just going to mix it up with my scribe. I don't want too much white in there, just enough to give it some interest, I guess. Something different, right? And you don't have to do this part if you want to add, dots or something else, but just again to show you guys different techniques and different things. And then once this dries, I'm going to outline it on top. So again, I'm going to leave it aside, let it crust over. And then we're going to go ahead and do some details on top. So when I say crust over, it basically just means it's dry enough to do some piping details on the top. And it's not going to sink into the icing or it's not going to ruin the icing. But if I did push too hard with my finger or my piping bag against the icing, it would still crack because the bottom underneath is still wet. But this lets us move on and do some details instead of waiting, for hours for the cookie to fully dry. So I'm just using my outline consistency here. This is thick icing. It holds its shape. And I'm going to outline the cactus, and then I'm just going to add a few lines to it as well. And every time that I want the icing, to start or stop, I usually touch down. You want to touch it against either the cookie or, the outline icing so that the icing sticks nicely. And just before I touch down, I always push a tiny bit of icing out of my bag. So I'm not necessarily touching my bag down to the icing. I'm getting a little blob of icing out and then touching that to the bag. And you can see sometimes the line breaks. You pull too fast, or I didn't push enough icing out and I pulled away too fast, so it broke my outline. But again, it's thicker icing, so it doesn't stick right away. So you can kind of pull it off really quickly and it, won't make a mark or anything. And this is also, it's good practice to practice your lines and touching and, starting and stopping and touching down, lifting up, touching down, and using some curves. You kind of get the feel for the bag, and you learn the control and the pressure of your hand and all those things that make you, get better at cookies. And I go slower when needed when they're smaller areas, and when they're bigger areas, it's easier. You can go a little bit quicker, put a little bit more pressure on the bag. But in smaller areas, I less pressure and I go slow so I have time to lay down the line where I want to. And I'm just going to add some dots here to the lines. And you can add as many or as little as you want, or none at all. It's really up to you, just giving you guys ideas of what to do, or how you want to make it. I don't really know what one of these cactuses looks like, but we're just going to go for it. And then here I'm just going to add a few lines just to make a little flower on top, just to give it some more color. It's a nice bright set, so I want lots of color in this set. Then we'll add another little one on the side here. So again, I'm just touching down. I squeeze a little bit of icing out of my bag, touch down. And these are such small lines, I just need a little squeeze the icing, and I'm just sort of pulling the icing straight. Cute little cactus. All right, this one is our flamingo. And don't mind the holes. It's a very narrow cookie cutter, and so to be able to get the dough out of the cookie cutter, I sort of stabbed it out with my knife. So those are why I have holes in there. Sometimes you can kind of pull the cookie cutter wider to get them out, but these narrow little sections are kind of hard. So you can see the feet and the head, and even a little bit by the tail there I had some issues. So that's kind of how I got it out without stretching it out too much. And again, I'm just outlining, going slow around the curves, taking my time. And again, this is a very narrow area, so I'm just going to add that extra support of the icing here. And then I like to flood on top of that thicker icing right away. So my outline I like to let dry, but the reason I flood over this icing I just put in the middle is because I don't want it to dry, because it breaks off really easily. So then it tends to just float around in my flood, because I'm touching it almost with my piping bag, or I'm pushing it around with my flood, and I don't want it to break off. And you can see I'm wiggling my bag as I go down. It's sort of a narrow spot where I put a lot of pressure on my bag to fill that area up, but it's not quite going over the edges. So I use my bag to swirl it around a little bit and just cover it, instead of putting my bag down, grabbing my scribe and trying to fix it. Just, saving that extra little step and just using the tip of my bag and squiggling it around and just making that area nice and full. And then I'm going to let this crust over, and once it's crusted over enough that I can go and do a second layer, I'm going to go ahead and do the wing. And then here I'm going to go in with my outline consistency and then fill it in right away with my flood. So sometimes I don't let it dry. Like in this case, it doesn't have to be perfect to the edge of the cookie, so I'm just filling it in right away with my flood, because then it's flexible to be able to move around. So I don't wait for my outline to dry, and I just fill it in with my flood, and you can see it's melted into the flood, and the outline is kind of one now. And the reason I do this is so that I could kind of shape the wing exactly how I want it, because if the outline dries, I can't really shape it. So if it's the edge of the cookie, I care, because I don't, I want it right to the edge. But for something like this that I don't have an exact edge to follow, I just want it more flexible so I can fix it if I need to push it out more or make it more pointy. So that gives me the flexibility. Here I'm doing the leg in my outline consistency. And this little foot here is very, very small. So when I have a tiny, tiny area like that, I just use my outline consistency, and then I just smooth it out with my scribe. A very tiny area like that is super easy to smooth out if you fill it up enough with your outline consistency, as long as it's not too stiff or super stiff. And again, with the beak, I'm going to use the same thing here. So I'm just going to outline it. And it's such a tiny area that I'm just going to go ahead and fill it in with my outline. And you can see it's outlined because it's not seeping over, and I've got a nice bubble of icing there, like a nice, dollop of icing. And if I put a really thin layer of outline consistency, I can't really smooth it out. But because I loaded that area up, it's super easy to smooth out with my scribe. We add a little black dot for the eye. I'm just going to smooth it out. And there you have it, a cute little flamingo. All right, here we've got an ice cream cone. And so I'm going to do the bottom part of the cone first. So here I'm going to outline it here. And I'm getting really close to that bottom edge. It's a curve, so I don't want to touch down. So I get really close just to get super control over that area. And I don't want to make it sharp. I want to keep that roundness. So I don't want to touch down. And then here I'm just, again, it's a smaller cookie, so just to prevent craters, it doesn't, you don't have to always do it. Sometimes I'm like, you know what, I'm not sure if it's going to crater. It's a smaller area, but it's not too small, but it takes a second for me to do it, so I'd rather just be safe than sorry. And again, just using my bag here to smooth out the icing as I go. That's what that circular motion is. And I'm going to put this aside, let it crust over, and here I'm going to outline the top of the cookie. Now notice with my outline, I started in the middle of the cookie this time. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that, this area stays separate. So I'm outlining it specifically like this, so that when we flood, that area will have a separation. And these little outer edges are very kind of curvy and not really straight. So then I'm going to just keep my bag really close and just go along best with the edges I can. And so see, now that I have those edges coming into the middle, you can sort of see that ball of ice cream on the top. And then back to my cone while my outline dries. I'll finish the details on my cone. So I'm just going to outline it. And then we're just going to put diagonal lines on it to give it that nice waffle cone look. And again, you see I'm just touching down on one side and then lifting my bag up slowly. The smaller lines I have, I don't lift my bag up as much. The wider the lines are, the longer the lines are, I lift my bag up a lot more because I have more space to lift it up and bring it down. So if you have trouble with that type of stuff, it's always good to practice, and the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll get, and the more you'll know, you'll do it without thinking anymore. I never do things one way. I always do whatever's more comfortable for me. So sometimes, I'll stay close to the cookie. Sometimes I'll lift it up. Just really depends how you feel and how much control you feel like you have over your piping bag. So now that my outline is nice and dry, so I know it's going to keep its shape, I'm going to go ahead and flood, and I'm going to stay away from those inside lines. So I'm going all the way kind of around. I usually try to pipe on top of my outline, but see, I went all the way around it. I don't really want to pipe on top of it because I want that separation of icing. I want it to look like someone took a big scoop of ice cream and plopped it on the cone. The icing, because it's flat icing, it's going to come together slowly. So that's why I kind of left a little extra space. And I can go in with my scribe a little bit and push it all the way to the edge, but I don't want to cover it. Like again, once it's dry, you'll see a lot better that it has a nice scoop of ice cream on top. All right, and on to our pineapple. So again, I have my outline consistency here. Now this pineapple, flamingo, and the cactus all came in a 3-pack set. So I thought it'd be fun to put them together. They're really small cookies. I normally bake larger cookies. I find them easier to decorate, to be honest. Because when you're doing details on a small cookie, it's a lot smaller and it feels a lot harder. But they are pretty cute and simpler cookies to decorate. So I really do enjoy decorating these ones, even though they're smaller than what I normally do. So again, going in with my flood here, just taking my time, and then I'm going to let it crust over. And again, you can put your cookies in front of a fan to speed up the process, or if you have a dehydrator. And then once it's crusted over, I can do those details. So you see that the outline is just sitting right on top, right? It's not melting into my icing because we let that layer dry a little bit. And again, I'm just touching down at one point, lifting my bag up a little bit, and then touching down. I almost wipe off the bag at the end there so it sticks. So I lift up my bag, and then when I come down again and touch, I sort of just rip the icing off. I kind of pull away the bag quickly and almost wipe the tip on against the edge there so it sticks down. Again, outline consistency because it's thicker icing. It's almost drier, and so it doesn't stick as well as a flat or looser icing. So you almost have to secure your icing down. So that's what I'm doing. That's why we touch down and make sure that your line is secure before you move on. And they don't have to be perfectly spaced or anything. I try my best, but sometimes it doesn't come out perfect, but nobody really notices in the end. Okay, so now we're going to do the top of the pineapple. So I have really thick green icing. I've added powdered sugar to it and made it nice and thick. The reason why I want it super thick is I want it to hold its shape. So my outline consistency is thick, but this is even thicker. You want it stiff. And then what I'm going to do is cut an upside down V, a small one, on my bag, and this will give me a leaf tip. And so if you don't have the actual tip, this is a great little hack that you can do to get a leaf. And if you have a tip, you can use that as well, but I find this easier because you don't need to, wash the tip after. And I always cut really small and test it out, and then if I need it bigger, I'll go bigger because it's always easier to, cut it bigger than rebag your icing. So all I do here is put some pressure down, and I'm just moving the bag kind of up and down, back and forth to give those little ripples. If you squeeze really hard and you move the bag slow, you'll kind of get the same effect with the ripples, but you get a feel for it. And then when I get to the end, I let go of the pressure and I pull the bag away. And always adjust the cookie. I try to make it face the camera or face myself, the easiest way without moving the cookie too much. But for these types of things, especially for this, for me, it's easier if I turn the cookie around. So if it's more comfortable for you to turn your cookie another different way, please do so. Don't follow exactly what I'm doing, because if it's more comfortable for you to do it your way, then that's what you should do. And here I'm just going to add a couple more leaves on top and then one in the middle just to hide that. I don't really like how the middle came out, so this way it kind of looks nice and full, and I think it looks more realistic. So I like how the pineapple comes out. It looks great. Okay, and we have one last watermelon here. So this is the other half of my circle, and I didn't cut a little bite mark out of this one. And again, we're going to be outlining our pink part. And I don't want to go right to the edge because we're going to save that for the green. And again, when you're doing these semicircles or circles, it's good to lift up your bag and then look a little bit ahead of where you're going, and you'll get a nice circle. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you want to, trace a semicircle there, you can do that as well. As much as perfect I want, my cookies to always turn out, sometimes you just have to accept that they won't always be perfect. But when you're making a bunch of cookies and people see a set, they really don't dive into the details. They don't look at every little flaw, and they just see this awesome set. So if you're, have little mistakes, I have tons. I get craters, small craters, big craters sometimes. Even if I try to prevent them, my cookies are a little thinner on one side than the other. My flat run over my edge. Things happen all the time. But you know what? Nobody that I've ever given cookies to is like, oh my gosh, that looks so terrible. So, don't be so hard on yourself. These little things you'll learn. And as much as you try to prevent them, sometimes they still happen. But it's a cookie. It's meant to be eaten. Nobody that I know will say no to a cookie. So don't stress over the little things. And you'll get better as you practice and as you get a better feel. All our cookies, everybody's cookies look terrible when they first start. They look great, but you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, I've come so far. So it's always good to keep practicing, take photos, look back every once in a while, and you will get better. And so here, while my green outline icing dries, I'm going to go ahead and do my seeds again. And once again, it's a very small hole, just holding it in one spot, putting pressure, and then letting go of the pressure and pulling away. And always practice these little things on a paper towel. I always do that before I'm going to go ahead and do it, just to get a feel of the bag. And once I have, done it a few times and it looks okay, then I'll say, okay, I'm ready to go for my cookie. And again, we're going to go in with a little squiggly line. This one's a little bit of a bigger area, so I can make a little bigger squiggle. And again, this just helps support the icing from caving in on itself. Not the end of the world if, it does or it craters, but it looks nicer when it doesn't. And then I'll just go ahead and flood and fill that in. And then we have our last watermelon cookie. Well, I hope you enjoyed that summer video, and I really hope you guys get a chance to make these. I've got a lot more in store for you, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching, and happy baking!